the deed hit the surface of Jacob Holloway's oak desk with a sound like a gunshot. Matilda Carter did not flinch when she placed it there. She had ridden 40 miles through red dust and summer heat to place that document exactly where it now lay, and her hand was steady as stone when she pulled it away. She straightened her black mourning dress, lifted her chin, and met the eyes of the man sitting across from her with a gaze that could have cut glass. "That land belonged to my husband," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, and carrying a fury inside it like a river carrying boulders beneath a calm surface. Thomas Carter purchased those 340 acres from the Territorial Land Office in the spring of 1882. I have the receipt. I have the correspondence. And I am telling you now, Mr. Holloway, that whatever document you are holding onto, whatever deed you believe gives you claim to Clearwater Flats, is either a forgery, a fraud, or both. Jacob Holloway did not move. He sat behind his desk in the stone ranch house he had built with his own hands 8 years ago, and he looked at the woman across from him, the way a man looks at a lightning storm that has appeared without warning on a clear day. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair threaded through with the first gray of a hard-worked life, and his eyes were the color of the Wyoming sky in October, a deep and complicated blue. He had been told he was an intimidating man. Most people who came into this room to argue with him left unsatisfied or afraid. Matilda Carter looked neither unsatisfied nor afraid. She looked like a woman who had been walking through fire for months and had decided that fire no longer had any power over her. "Sit down, Mrs. Carter," he said quietly. "I will not sit down. I will have an answer." "You will have an answer when you sit down," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a kind of firm patience that confused her because she had come prepared for cruelty. She had come prepared for the kind of man her late husband's solicitor had described, a land-hungry rancher who had swooped in like a vulture the moment Thomas Carter's body was cold in the ground, claiming a deed that nobody in Holt County had ever seen before. She had come prepared for a fight with a villain. She sat down, because something in his voice disarmed the script she had written for this confrontation, and she hated herself a little for it. Jacob opened the drawer of his desk and removed a different document from the one she had slapped down. He placed it beside hers with careful, deliberate hands. He smoothed it flat. He turned it so she could read it. "The date on your husband's deed is April 14th, 1882, he said. She looked. "That is correct." "The date on mine is November 9th, 1876. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Matilda Carter had ever heard. She stared at the document. The ink was old, and she could see that it was old the way you can see age in a person's face, not just by its yellowing, but by the quality of the paper, the style of the territorial notary's seal pressed into the lower left corner, the handwriting of the clerk who had recorded it. She had spent 3 months reading land documents. She knew what an old deed looked like. This one was 6 years older than Thomas's. Her mind began to work backward through everything she had believed to be true about this dispute, and the architecture of her certainty began to crack in ways she could feel physically, like something loosening in her chest. "That cannot be right," she said, but her voice had lost its steel edge and they both noticed. "I did not want it to be right either," Jacob said, and the way he said it made her look up at him again. There was something in his face that she had not expected to find there. Not triumph, not the satisfied smirk of a man who has won, something that looked dangerously close to sorrow. "Because if my deed is legitimate, and it is, then your husband was sold a piece of land that was already claimed. And whoever sold it to him committed the fraud, not me." Matilda said nothing. The clock on his mantelpiece ticked 6 times in the space of her silence. "Who sold him the land?" she asked finally. Jacob reached into his drawer again and placed one more document on the desk. It was a letter, and the signature at the bottom of it was one she recognized, because it had been in every piece of correspondence her husband had ever shown her regarding the purchase of Clearwater Flats. Raymond Ellis, the Territorial Land Commissioner for Holt County. The world tilted under her feet even though she was sitting still. Raymond Ellis had been the one who told her, 6 weeks after Thomas died, that the deed might be contested. Raymond Ellis had been the one who suggested she ride out to Holloway's ranch to settle the matter personally. Raymond Ellis had been the one who told her that Jacob Holloway was a thief and a land grabber who had produced a fraudulent deed after Thomas's death to steal what was rightfully the Carter estate. Raymond Ellis had sent her here like a weapon aimed at Jacob Holloway, and she was only beginning to understand why. That morning in September of 1883 felt like a kind of death itself, the death of the story she had been living inside for 3 months, and Matilda Carter sat across from Jacob Holloway and felt the full weight of her own betrayal settle over her like dust after a stampede. Not her betrayal, the betrayal done to her. She pressed her fingers flat against the edge of the desk to keep them from trembling. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning." Jacob Holloway looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some wall that had been up since she walked in, moving back an inch, the way a gate swings open when someone stops pulling against it. "It is a long story," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she replied, and they both understood that was true in more ways than one. The story began, as most dark stories do, with land and money and a man who wanted both more than he wanted to be honest. Jacob had come to Holt County, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1875. He was 26 years old, newly arrived from Ohio with a stake of $400 he had saved over 5 years of working other men's cattle, and a burning, uncomplicated desire to build something that was his own. The territory was raw then, wide open in the way that makes a young man feel simultaneously small and enormous, like the world has handed you a blank page and told you to fill it however you choose. He had scouted land for 3 weeks before he found Clearwater Flats. It was not the largest piece of land he had considered. It was not the most fertile in obvious terms, but it had the creek. That was the thing that none of the other parcels had. A year-round creek fed by snowmelt from the Wind River Range, cold and clean, and reliable in a way that water in Wyoming simply was not guaranteed to be. He had stood on that ground in October with the autumn grass gold around his boots, and he had felt something he could not name at the time, something that was not just want but recognition, as though the land had been waiting for him specifically. He had gone to the Territorial Land Office in November, and he had paid $320 for 340 acres, and he had walked out with a deed that he folded into a leather case and kept in his coat pocket for 3 days afterward, because he could not quite bring himself to let it out of reach. He had spent the winter in a dugout. He had built the stone house the following spring and summer, carrying fieldstone up from the creek bed himself, because he could not afford to pay anyone to do it for him. He had planted his first herd of 20 cattle on the land in 1877, and by 1879 he had 60. He had made friends slowly, the way solitary men do, and enemies even more slowly, because he was a man who preferred to be left alone and extended the same courtesy to others. Raymond Ellis had arrived in Holt County as the new Territorial Land Commissioner in 1880. Jacob had met him at a town gathering in Britton's Mill, the nearest town of any size to his ranch, and had thought nothing particular of him at the time. Ellis was a compact, well-dressed man of about 50, with the smooth manners of someone who had been trained to make people comfortable, and an interest in land values that Jacob had initially taken for professional dedication. The interest had revealed itself as something else entirely in the spring of 1881, when Ellis had come to Clearwater Flats and offered to buy Jacob out. Jacob told this part of the story without embellishment. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that sat on the iron stove in the corner and placed one in front of Matilda because she looked, he thought, like someone who needed something warm to hold on to. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup without comment and listened. Ellis had offered $500 for the property. Jacob had declined. Ellis had come back in the summer with $700. Jacob had declined again. In the fall, Ellis had arrived with a different kind of offer, not a price, but a warning, dressed up in the language of concern. He had mentioned, in a vague and carefully deniable way, that there might be some irregularity in the original territorial records from 1876, some question about the validity of certain deeds filed during that period. He had suggested that Jacob might find it easier and safer to resolve the matter by accepting a fair market price for the land and moving on. Jacob had looked at him for a long time after that and then asked him to leave. After Ellis left, Jacob had done two things. He had written to a land attorney in Cheyenne and had his deed verified and properly witnessed before the circuit court judge when he next came through. And he had filed a formal record of the deed with the district land office in addition to the territorial office, creating a double record that would be significantly harder to tamper with. He had not thought about Raymond Ellis much after that, except as a man to be cautious around. He had not known what Ellis was planning because the plan, as Jacob now understood it, had been more sophisticated and more patient than he had imagined. "He sold your husband Clearwater Flats in April of 1882, Jacob said. He was leaning forward now with his forearms on the desk, not in an aggressive way but in the posture of a man who is working through something with another person. "I did not know about it until after your husband had already built on it." Matilda set her cup down. "Thomas built a house on that land. I know, I saw it. You saw it and you said nothing." "I tried," Jacob said, and now there was something in his voice that was not quite anger but was in the neighborhood of it. "I rode out there in August of 1882 to speak to your husband directly. I brought my deed. I wanted to resolve it quietly between the two of us without involving the land office or the courts because I knew what Ellis was and I knew that involving the official machinery would benefit him and hurt everyone else." Matilda was very still. "Thomas never told me you came. I believe that, because when I rode up to that house, Raymond Ellis was already there. He saw me coming. He intercepted me before I could reach your husband. And he told me in terms that were quite clear that if I pursued my claim against a recently settled family who had paid good money for their homestead, he would see to it that questions about my original deed were raised formally before the territorial court." Jacob paused. "He also told me that your husband was not a well man." The words landed softly and heavily at the same time. Matilda's throat tightened. Thomas had been ill. He had known it by the summer of 1882, though he had kept the full severity of it from her for longer than he should have. The consumption had taken him in February of 1883, 7 months later, leaving her with a house on disputed land, 2 horses, a small herd of mixed cattle, and a grief that she was still carrying like a stone in her chest. "Ellis used Thomas's illness as a shield," she said slowly. "He knew you would not pursue the claim against a dying man's family." "He was correct," Jacob said quietly. "I chose to wait. I told myself I would find another way. And then Thomas died and Ellis told me that you had produced a fraudulent deed. Yes, he sent me here to confront you. Yes, I expect he hoped one of 2 things would happen. Either I would be frightened by the threat of a formal dispute and sell, or you would be frightened by the complexity of the situation and sell, and either way he would get what he wanted." Matilda looked at the 2 deeds lying side by side on the desk between them, and she thought about the 6 months since Thomas's death, the grief and the paperwork and the sleepless nights, and the conversation with Ellis that had sent her on a 40-mile ride through the September heat with a heart full of righteous fury aimed at entirely the wrong man. "He played us both," she said. "He played everyone he could reach," Jacob said. "That seems to be his habit." There was a silence between them then that was different from the earlier silence. The earlier silence had been the silence of confrontation, 2 people standing on opposite sides of a line. This silence was something else, the silence of 2 people who have just discovered they are standing on the same side of the same problem, looking at the same enemy. It was not a comfortable silence exactly, but it was an honest one. "What do we do?" Matilda asked. It was the first time she had used the word "we," and Jacob noticed it, and something in him that had been carefully guarded since she walked through his door shifted another inch. "I have been working on that question for some time," he said. "I have some thoughts, but first I think you should probably eat something, because you rode 40 miles this morning and you look like you are about to fall over." Matilda Carter, who had not been told by anyone what she looked like in several months because there had been no one around to tell her, felt something unexpected happen behind her sternum. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something smaller and more startling than gratitude, the simple shock of being seen by a stranger who had every reason not to bother. "I am not going to fall over," she said. "Of course not," he agreed, in a tone that suggested he believed her and also still intended to feed her. He made her a meal in the stone kitchen at the back of the house, which was clean in the way that a man's kitchen is clean when he has been keeping house alone for a long time and has developed his own system for it. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a shelf of labeled tin canisters, and an iron skillet seasoned to a black mirror finish that told her he cooked regularly and well. He made cornbread and sliced cold ham, and reheated the remains of what appeared to be a bean soup with good depth of flavor, and he set it all on the table in the kitchen and sat across from her and ate his own meal and did not make a production of the hospitality. Matilda ate. She was, in fact, very hungry, and the food was very good, and she ate more than she had intended to and felt the color come back into her face by degrees. "You cook well," she said. "I had no one to do it for me," he replied without self-pity. "Just fact." She looked at him across the table. In the kitchen light, without the desk between them and the confrontation still crackling in the air, she saw him differently. He had a quality of stillness about him that she associated with men who were comfortable with silence, who did not need to fill every moment with noise to feel at ease in themselves. His hands on the table were large and were cruffined and entirely at rest, which was a thing she noticed because Thomas's hands had always been moving, always fidgeting, always finding something to occupy them. She had loved that about Thomas. It was one of the 1,000 small things she still caught herself missing when she was not braced for it. "How long have you been alone out here?" she asked. He considered the question with the same deliberateness he seemed to apply to everything. 8 years since I came here. Never married. Had a woman in town for a while a few years ago. That ended." He said the last part without apparent bitterness, just the plain fact of a thing that had happened and was over. "I have been a widow for 7 months, she said. "I know. Ellis told me when he came to warn me you were likely to contest the deed." He paused. "I am sorry for your loss." She had heard those words dozens of times in the 7 months since Thomas died. She had learned to accept them with a nod and a brief expression of appropriate sorrow, and to move on quickly because people meant them kindly, but the words themselves had become like a worn coin, handled so many times the face was barely visible. When Jacob Holloway said them, across a kitchen table over the remains of a meal he had made her without being asked, they sounded different. They sounded like he meant the actual individual words in the actual order he was saying them. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than it had been all day. They sat together with the meal cooling between them, and outside the kitchen window the Wyoming afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons do in September, running through gold toward long shadows at a pace that always seemed slightly too fast, the beauty of the high country never quite willing to let you settle into it before it moved on. "Tell me your plan," she said at last. "You said you had thoughts about what to do." "I do," he said. He stood and cleared the table with the efficiency of long habit and poured them each more coffee and sat back down. "I wrote to the territorial court in Cheyenne 6 months ago, before Ellis came to warn me about you. I had already begun the process of formally challenging his authority to have sold land he did not have the right to sell. The problem is that Ellis has friends in the territorial administration, and the process has been slow." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "What I need is more documentation. Your husband's purchase records, the correspondence he received from Ellis about the sale, receipts, anything that shows the chain of what Ellis did. That documentation, combined with my original deed and the attorney's verification from 1881, and a formal complaint from your household as the defrauded second buyer, could be enough to have Ellis removed from his position and the matter settled by the court. Matilda felt something stir in her that had been dormant for months. Purpose. The specific energy of a problem that has a solution if you work hard enough for it. I have all of that, she said. Thomas kept everything. He was meticulous about records. She paused. The house on Clearwater Flats. Do I need to vacate it while this is being resolved? Jacob looked at her steadily. No, but the land is legally yours. The land will be legally mine when the court confirms it, he said, which may take some months. In the meantime, you are living on it and you have a herd to tend, and it is September and winter comes early at this elevation. He said it as though it were simple. Stay where you are. We will resolve the legal question when we have everything we need to resolve it properly. Matilda Carter looked at Jacob Holloway and tried to locate the hidden motive in what he had just offered her. She had learned in the 7 months since Thomas's death to look for hidden motives in everything, because the world had revealed itself to be a place where people said one thing and wanted another. She looked at him carefully, the way she had learned to look, and she found nothing that she could name as calculation. What she found instead was a man who was being straightforward with her in a situation that would have given a less principled person considerable leverage, and who seemed to find nothing remarkable about it. It was, she realized with something that felt like vertigo, one of the most disarming things she had ever encountered. "All right," she said. "I will gather the documents and bring them to you." "There is no rush today," he said. "You rode 40 miles this morning. You should stay the night and ride back in the morning when you are rested." She opened her mouth to decline because she was a widow and this was a single man's household and the year was 1883 and the proprieties were what they were. He seemed to anticipate this. "I have a spare room. The door has a latch. It is 8 miles to the nearest house and 12 to Britton's Mill, and I am not asking you to do anything except get some sleep before you make the ride back." He was looking at her with that steady, complicated blue gaze. "I know what you are thinking about propriety. I understand it, but it is a practical matter and I am offering practical shelter, nothing more." "You are a very practical man," she said, because it was what came to her. "When I have to be," he replied, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that might, in different circumstances, have been a smile. She stayed. The spare room was small and clean with a rope bed, and a quilt in a double wedding ring pattern that had clearly been made by someone else's hands and stored with care. She lay in it that night listening to the Wyoming dark, which was different from darkness in other places, larger and more alive with sound, coyotes and wind and the distant sound of the creek she could not see. She thought about Thomas. She did so deliberately, the way you press on a bruise to know the extent of it. She thought about his hands and his laugh and the way he had read aloud to her in the evenings, novels and territorial newspapers, and once, memorably, an entire agricultural almanac because they had run out of anything else. She thought about the fact that he had bought their land in good faith and someone had taken advantage of that faith, and the anger that rose in her at that thought was clean and energizing compared to grief, which was murky and exhausting. She thought about Jacob Holloway, and then she stopped thinking about Jacob Holloway because it felt like a dangerous territory she was not ready to enter. She slept better than she had in weeks. In the morning she found that he had already been up for hours. There was fresh bread on the kitchen table, and a pot of coffee, and a piece of paper with a list of the documents he needed from her, written in a clear, precise hand. He was out at the barn when she found him, and she stood in the doorway watching him work for a moment before she said anything. He was mending a harness with the focus of someone who finds satisfaction in making a broken thing whole, and he did not hear her at first, and she observed him in his natural state, a man comfortable in his own space, unhurried, the early September light coming through the barn door and laying itself across him in clean planks of gold. "Your bread is very good," she said. He looked up. "My mother's recipe, she made me learn it before I left Ohio." He set the harness down. "Did you sleep?" "I did, better than expected." "Good." He stood and wiped his hands on his work pants. "I have your horse saddled. She is a good mare." "Her name is Clara," Matilda said. "Thomas named her." Something passed across Jacob's face at that, brief and careful. "She is well cared for." "I try," Matilda said. And then, because she had been thinking it since she woke and had decided to say it, "I owe you an apology for yesterday. I came here with a great deal of accusation and very little information." "You came here with the information you had," he said. "It was the wrong information. That is not your fault. I was not kind about it." "You were not unkind," he said thoughtfully. "You were angry, and you had every right to be angry. You were just angry at the wrong person. I cannot blame you for that." He picked up the harness again and then set it back down as if reconsidering something. "Can I ask you a question?" "Yes." "When Ellis told you to come here, when he told you that I had produced a fraudulent deed, did you believe him without question, or did something in you hesitate?" Matilda considered this honestly. "Something in me hesitated," she said. "He was too helpful about it, too eager to send me. I should have paid more attention to that hesitation." "I think you are the kind of woman who pays attention to things," Jacob said. "I think you have been so deep in grief that some of your instruments were not reading correctly. That is not a failing, that is just what grief does." She looked at him. "You have lost someone," she said. It was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "My father 3 years ago, not recently, but yes." "It changes how you see things," she said. "It does," he agreed. "It changes the instruments." She rode back to Clearwater Flats that morning with his list of needed documents in her coat pocket, and a feeling that was difficult to categorize. Not happiness exactly, nothing so simple as that, but something lighter than the weight she had been carrying when she rode out the previous morning. Something that had to do with the existence, in a world that had recently proven itself to be dishonest in multiple large and painful ways, of a person who seemed to simply be what he appeared to be. The house on Clearwater Flats was a simple one, 2 rooms with a sleeping loft, built by Thomas and 2 hired men over the spring and summer of 1882. She had made it her own in the quiet, determined way that women make spaces their own. Curtains she had sewn herself and a rag rug, and a shelf of the books she had brought from Missouri when she and Thomas had come west. She stood in it now and looked at it with new eyes, the eyes of a woman who knew the ground under it was not hers, had never been hers, and found that this knowledge did not make her feel homeless, but instead made her feel something more complicated. She spent the day going through Thomas's papers. He had kept everything in a locked tin box under the floorboards of the bedroom, which was the kind of place you hide things when you are a man who has lived through enough uncertainty to know that important things need protecting. There were letters from Ellis. There were receipts. There was the original deed with the April 1882 date, and next to it, in Thomas's meticulous hand, a log of every communication he had ever had with the Territorial Land Commissioner about the purchase. Reading through, it was like reading a map of a trap being set. Ellis had been smooth and professional throughout every exchange. He had provided all the right documentation, all the proper forms, had even volunteered references which, she now understood, were probably other men he had similarly deceived. Thomas had had no reason to doubt any of it. She pulled out every document that Jacob had listed and added several more that she thought might be useful, and she wrapped them carefully in oilcloth and set them aside. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the house that was not legally hers and allowed herself, for the first time since Thomas died, to feel something other than grief or anger or the exhausted determination to survive. She allowed herself to feel something that might cautiously be called the first edge of possibility, not happiness, not hope, just the bare, tentative sense that the world she was living in might have dimensions she had not yet mapped. Jacob Holloway's face moved through her thoughts like something she could not quite catch hold of, and she did not try to catch it. She let it pass. She rode back to his ranch 3 days later when she had organized everything to her satisfaction. She had also, in those 3 days, made some inquiries of her own, riding into Britton's mill and speaking to the postmaster and the general store owner, two people who had a comprehensive knowledge of everything that happened in Holt County, and what she learned there confirmed and expanded what Jacob had told her. Ellis had been buying up land through various methods for several years. He had sold parcels he had no right to sell. He had created paper trails that looked legitimate long enough to confuse matters, and by the time anyone thought to question them, he had usually already collected the money and moved the problem along. Two other families in the county were dealing with similar disputes, though none of them seemed to know yet that their disputes were connected to each other. There was a dark momentum to what Ellis had done, the momentum of a man who was certain he would never be held accountable. That certainty was, Matilda thought, perhaps the thing she could use against him. Jacob was waiting for her on the porch of the stone house when she rode up, as though he had heard her coming from a distance and come out to meet her. She liked this about him, she noted clinically, the way he faced things directly rather than waiting for them to come to him. She gave him the documents. He spread them on the table and went through them with the focused attention of a man who is building a case brick by careful brick, and she sat across from him and watched him work and told him what she had learned in Britton's mill. When she was done, he looked up from the papers. "The other families," he said, "the Petersons and the McGills. You know them. I know of them. I suspected Ellis had done this elsewhere. I need to write to them." He sat back. "And I need to write to my attorney in Cheyenne again today with this new information." He looked at her with an expression that was serious and also something else. "You are a remarkable investigator, Mrs. Carter." "I am a woman with a great deal of motivation," she replied. "That is the best kind," he said, and for the first time fully he smiled, and it transformed his face in a way that she was not prepared for, opening something in it that the habitual composure kept closed, warmth and intelligence and a kind of humor that did not need to announce itself. She looked back down at the papers. Over the following weeks they developed a rhythm of correspondence and collaboration that began formally and became, by degrees, something less formal and more natural. He wrote to his attorney. She wrote to Thomas's solicitor in Missouri. They compared notes. They rode out together twice to Britton's mill to speak with the postmaster and the county recorder, and the ease with which they moved through these tasks together was something neither of them commented on directly, because to comment on it would have been to acknowledge what it meant. October arrived, and the high country began its annual preparation for winter with the focused efficiency of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The aspens turned a pure and blazing gold that made the world look briefly like something from outside of ordinary time. The creek at Clearwater Flats ran cold and bright. Matilda began preparing her woodpile and her larder and her herd for the months ahead, and Jacob, who had been doing this for 8 years and had systems for everything, appeared one morning with 2 of his ranch hands and 3 wagon loads of cut timber, and spent the day helping her woodpile reach a height that would see her comfortably through to spring. She made dinner for all 3 of them that evening, a proper dinner with the good dishes she had brought from Missouri, and she realized as she was cooking it that she was not doing it out of obligation, but out of something closer to pleasure. And this realization made her pause over the stove for a moment with a wooden spoon in her hand and her thoughts in a complicated country she was only beginning to navigate. Jacob's ranch hands, 2 brothers named Will and Pete Danvers who had worked for him for 4 years and treated him with the relaxed loyalty of people who have found an employer they genuinely respect, clearly thought nothing unusual about their employer spending a significant portion of his October helping a widow on a neighboring property. They were comfortable in her kitchen and polite at her table, and they rode home after dinner talking about the food. Jacob stayed a little longer, helping her carry the dishes in from the porch where they had eaten, because October evenings at that elevation require a jacket but are otherwise among the finest things available to human experience, the sky full of cold stars coming out one by one and the air smelling of pine and distant snow. "You did not have to bring the timber," she said, washing dishes in the basin while he dried them without being asked. "Practical matter," he said. "Same as the spare room." "You keep calling things practical. They are practical, Jacob." She stopped washing and looked at him. She had started using his given name 2 weeks ago, and he had started using hers, and neither of them had made note of the moment it happened. "You have been spending considerable time and effort helping me. A woman who showed up at your door a month ago accusing you of fraud. I would like to understand why." He dried the same plate twice, which was the first time she had seen him do anything that suggested he was not entirely composed. He set it down on the shelf. "Because you came here in good faith fighting for something you believed was right," he said. "Because you were deceived by the same man who tried to deceive me, and you deserve to have that corrected. And because—" He paused. He was looking at the dish shelf with the particular attention of a man who is choosing his next words the way you choose a step in uncertain terrain. "Because I find that I look forward to seeing you, when you ride up, and that has not happened in a long time, and I would rather be honest about it than pretend otherwise." The night outside the window was very quiet, just the wind and the creek and the faraway conversation of coyotes on the ridgeline. Matilda set down the dish she was holding and turned to face him. He was watching her now, the same steady blue gaze that had been disconcerting since the first moment she walked into his study, but there was something different in it now, something that was not hidden or guarded, that was just there, plain and patient and honest. "Thomas has been gone 7 months, she said. "I know. I am not." She stopped, started again. "I did not come here looking for anything except justice for his estate." "I know that too," he said, "and I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you something true. What you do with it is entirely your own business." She thought, standing in her kitchen in the October dark, about the fact that Thomas would have liked Jacob Holloway. She was quite certain of it. Thomas had had an instinct for people of genuine character and a corresponding impatience with pretension, and Jacob Holloway was the least pretentious person she had met in the territory. She thought about what it meant to honor grief without being imprisoned by it. She thought about the way her chest had been a closed room for 7 months, and the way she had occasionally, in the last few weeks, felt fresh air moving through it. "I look forward to it as well," she said, "when you ride up." Jacob Holloway said nothing, but what happened in his face when she said it was something she would think about for a long time afterward, relief and warmth and something that was trying hard not to be too much too quickly, all of it there and then contained again, the way a fire establishes itself before settling into its true shape. "Good," he said, and then, "You have a pot left to wash." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months, and it surprised them both. It was not a grand or dramatic laugh, but an ordinary one, the kind that slips out when your guard is down and something genuinely delights you. And she put her hand over her mouth like she was catching it, and he looked at her like a man who has just heard music he forgot existed. November arrived with its characteristic Wyoming authority, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in 3 days, and the first real snow coming down hard and sideways across the flats. The legal situation was progressing. Jacob's attorney in Cheyenne had filed formal papers with the district court, and the additional evidence from Matilda's documents, combined with statements gathered from the Peterson and McGill families, who had proven equally willing to testify once they understood they were not alone, had created a case that even Ellis's connections in the administration were going to find difficult to shield him from. Ellis himself appeared in Britton's mill in the middle of November with a different demeanor than Matilda had ever seen from him, less smooth, less certain of himself, the composure of a man who is beginning to feel the ground shift beneath his careful constructions. He came to see her at the Clearwater Flats house on a Tuesday afternoon, and she stood in her doorway and let him talk. He was still attempting the same game, still suggesting that the dispute could be resolved quietly if she would simply accept a reasonable settlement and sell the property. He had shifted the story somewhat, was now suggesting that both she and Holloway had been victims of confusion in the territorial records rather than his deliberate fraud. He was calm and professional, and she could see the machinery of his manipulation working, and recognized it now the way you recognize a con once you have seen through it. The mechanism is still there, still moving, but it has become transparent. "Mr. Ellis," she said when he finished, "I believe you should speak to my attorney." His face did something involuntary at that, the briefest flash of something that was not the smooth concern he had been displaying, something sharper and colder, and then the mask came back. "Of course," he said, "of course. I only wanted to offer a resolution before things became formal." "They are already formal," she said. "They have been formal since October. I look forward to seeing you in court." She closed the door. She rode to Jacob's ranch the next day to tell him about the visit, and she also told him, because it seemed relevant, that Ellis had been asking around Britton's mill about her finances, specifically about whether she had the resources to maintain a prolonged legal case. This was a new tactic, the suggestion that she could be starved out of the fight. Jacob listened to all of this. He was standing by the stone fireplace in his front room, which was a comfortable room with deep chairs and shelves of books, and a worn rug on the flagstone floor, the room of a man who reads and thinks and has built himself a life that has space in it for both. "He is getting desperate," Jacob said. "Yes. Desperate men make mistakes. They do." He turned from the fireplace to look at her. She was sitting in one of the deep chairs with her coat still on because she had only just come in, and the firelight was in her hair, and he made himself look at the problem instead of her because he was not a man who allowed himself to be distracted by beautiful things at inopportune moments. "Are your finances sound enough to continue?" "Barely," she said honestly. "Thomas left some savings. The cattle are producing, but if this goes on much past spring I will begin to have difficulty. Then we should combine resources." She looked at him. "Legally," he said quickly, and then seemed to reconsider the word, and there was a moment in which something larger than the legal situation was implied in the space between them, and both of them felt it, and neither of them addressed it directly. "I mean that we should file jointly as co-plaintiffs. It would be more efficient and reduce the cost per party." "Yes," she said. "That makes sense." She did not leave as quickly that day as she usually did. The snow was falling outside, reducing the world to a gray and white immediacy, and there was a fire and a pot of coffee and a conversation that began with the legal situation and moved gradually, as their conversations had begun to do, into other territories. He told her about Ohio, about his father's hardware store and the smell of metal and sawdust that had been the smell of his childhood, and the morning he had announced he was going west and his mother had fed him an enormous breakfast without comment, and then cried in the kitchen when she thought he could not hear. She told him about Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been his first and best student, about the library in their house that was twice the size their income justified, about meeting Thomas at a harvest social when she was 22 and he was 25, and the 3 years of courtship that had preceded their marriage because her father had wanted to be entirely certain. Thomas understood the full weight of what he was taking on. "He sounds like a good man," Jacob said. "He was," she said. "He was not perfect. He kept things from me that he should not have, about his health and about the uncertainty with the land. He was trying to protect me, and it made things harder in the end." She paused. "But he was good. He was genuinely good." "That is the right way to hold it," Jacob said quietly, clearly, honestly, "not turned into something perfect because he is gone, but not diminished either." She looked at him. "Did you love her, the woman from town?" The question came out before she had fully decided to ask it. He did not seem offended. "I thought I did," he said. "For a while I was certain of it. Then I was less certain, and then she left, and I was mostly certain that I had been in love with the idea of someone rather than the person herself, which is different." He looked at the fire. "She wanted to live in a city. She was right to leave. It would have made both of us unhappy." "She wanted you to leave the land," Matilda said, not a question. "Yes, and you wouldn't." And I wouldn't, he confirmed. I tried to explain it to her. She thought it was stubbornness, and maybe some of it was, but the land is not just land to me. It is the thing I built when I had nothing, and it is the proof that a person can make something out of intention and effort, and selling it would be like selling a piece of myself that I am not willing to sell. He said all of this matter-of-factly, without drama. I did not expect that to be difficult for someone to understand. It is not difficult to understand, Matilda said. It is easy to understand. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the fire spoke between them in its quiet, crackling language. She rode home in the snow that evening, and she thought about what he had said about the land, and she thought about the fact that this was why he had never sold, not to Ellis, not to anyone. Not stubbornness, not greed, something older and more personal and more honest than either of those things. The land was him, or a part of him, the part that was proof. She understood it completely, and the understanding felt like another wall coming down between them. December came and went. The legal case ground forward at the pace legal cases in the Wyoming Territory ground forward, which was not fast. But the documentation was solid, and the attorney was capable, and the district court judge, unlike many officials Ellis had managed to influence, was beyond his reach. They spent Christmas Day together at Jacob's ranch, along with Will and Pete Danvers and Pete's wife Clara, who had come up from their homestead 5 miles south. And it was a plain and warm celebration with good food and a fire in the main room, and a bottle of whiskey produced with ceremony by Will at approximately 8 in the evening. Matilda had brought a dried apple pie and received from Jacob a small volume of Tennyson that he had found in a bookshop in Cheyenne on his last supply trip, inscribed inside the front cover with her name and the date and nothing else, which was, she thought, exactly the right amount. She pressed her fingers over his name written in her name, and felt something move in her chest with a force that was no longer something she was willing to call ambiguous. January of 1884 was cold enough to make breathing outdoors feel like a small act of courage. She and Jacob saw each other less during the worst of the weather because the ride between their properties became genuinely difficult, and the absence was instructive. She found herself marking the days between visits, and noting when she began to mark them, and acknowledging to herself, in the privacy of her own mind, what that meant. In February, exactly 1 year after Thomas's death, she sat at the table in the Clearwater Flats house and let herself grieve fully one more time, crying until there were no more tears and then sitting in the quiet that follows them, and it felt different from the grief she had carried all year, not lesser but more settled, the way a wound finally closes into a scar. Not gone, changed. She wrote to her mother in Missouri that night, the first truly honest letter she had written since Thomas died. She wrote about the land dispute and about what she had discovered and about Jacob Holloway, and she was careful with what she said about him, but not careful enough that her mother, who had been her father's most perceptive student, would miss what was between the lines. Her mother wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was 2 pages long, and the relevant part was 1 sentence near the end. You have always known your own mind, Matilda. Trust it now. The court hearing was scheduled for March 20th, 1884, in the district courthouse in the town of Laramie, which was 60 miles from Britain's Mill and therefore required travel. Jacob arranged for Pete and Will to manage both properties in their absence. He arranged transportation, a hired buggy for the journey because Matilda's mare was in the early stages of a pregnancy that made long travel inadvisable. They rode to Laramie over 2 days, staying the first night at a way station where the proprietress, a brisk and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Alcott, gave them adjacent rooms and made no particular comment because she had seen enough of the territory to recognize 2 people in the middle of something complicated. Over dinner at the way station, with a lamp between them and the road sounds of an overnight place around them, Jacob reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not speak. It was not a gesture that required speech. It was simply the acknowledgement of something that had been building since September, allowed finally into the open without qualification or excuse. Matilda turned her hand palm up and held his, and they sat like that for a while with the lamp between them and the night outside, and it felt like the most natural thing that had happened to her in a very long time. The courthouse in Laramie was a serious stone building that took its function seriously, which Matilda appreciated. They arrived the morning of the hearing, and the first person she saw on the steps was Raymond Ellis, flanked by two attorneys in good suits who had the assured manner of men accustomed to winning in rooms like this one. Ellis saw her, and his expression did something complex, recognition and calculation, and the briefest flash of what might have been guilt, all passing across his face too fast to be entirely controlled. He looked at Jacob beside her, and whatever he saw in the two of them standing together told him something about the nature of what he was facing, because he turned away quickly and spoke to his attorneys with the urgency of someone recalibrating. Jacob's attorney, a precise and formidable man named Henry Whitmore who had come up from Cheyenne specifically for this, met them on the steps and walked them through the presentation. He was confident in a way that was not theatrical, just the confidence of someone who has a strong case and knows it. The hearing lasted most of the day. Matilda testified. She was composed and exact, presenting the timeline of Thomas's purchase, the documentation of Ellis's correspondence, the evidence of what she had uncovered. She watched the judge, an older man with a face like weathered wood and eyes that missed nothing, tracking every document she referenced and making notes in a small book with a steel pen. Jacob testified. He presented his 1876 deed, the attorney's 1881 verification, the record of Ellis's purchase offers and veiled threats, and the correspondence from the Peterson and McGill families that documented the same pattern of fraud. Henry Whitmore argued the case with the kind of measured intensity that is more convincing than theatrics, laying out the documented evidence that Ellis had knowingly sold land he could not legally sell, multiple times, to multiple buyers, while using his official position to suppress challenges to his scheme. Ellis's attorneys presented their case, which rested primarily on alleged confusion in the territorial records and the suggestion that Ellis had acted in good faith based on information available to him at the time. They were good lawyers, but they were working with a weak foundation. The judge deliberated overnight. In the morning, he returned a finding that was comprehensive and unambiguous. Jacob Holloway's original 1876 deed was confirmed as the valid claim to Clearwater Flats. Raymond Ellis was found to have committed fraud in the sale of land he did not have the right to sell. The matter of Ellis's removal from his position as Territorial Land Commissioner was referred to the Territorial Governor's office with the court's strong recommendation. Restitution to the defrauded parties, including the Carter estate, the Peterson family, and the McGill family, was ordered to be paid from Ellis's personal assets, which the court had already moved to freeze pending the hearing. Ellis sat very still when the judgment was read. His attorneys murmured to him. He did not respond. He looked, Matilda thought, like a man watching the architecture of something he built very carefully come apart, and she found that she felt nothing particular about it except a clean, complete sense of justice. Not triumph. Justice. There is a difference. She and Jacob walked out of the courthouse into the March morning of Laramie, Wyoming, and the light was cold and clear, and the sky was an impossible blue, and she stopped on the steps and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle through her. "It is over," she said. "The legal part," Jacob agreed. He was standing beside her, close enough that their arms were touching, and he was looking at her rather than at Laramie. "What part comes after the legal part?" she asked, and she was asking it the way you ask a question when you already know the answer but want to hear it said. "Whatever we decide," he said. She looked at him. The March wind was doing things to her hair that she could not control, and she did not try to control them. The courthouse steps were busy with people going in and out, and none of them were paying attention to the two people standing slightly apart from the flow of traffic, two people who had come to this moment from opposite sides of a dispute and found, somewhere in the middle of fighting at each other. "The land," she said. "Clearwater Flats. What happens to the house?" "That is a question we should discuss," he said, "but not here." He offered her his arm in the formal way of the time, and it was both formal and entirely genuine, the way he did most things, layered but never dishonest. "There is a decent restaurant on the main street. Let us eat breakfast and talk." She took his arm. Over breakfast in a Laramie restaurant with good coffee and eggs cooked properly, and the victory of the morning still bright between them, they talked about the land. The legal situation, now resolved, left Clearwater Flats in Jacob's possession. This was correct and right. What it also left was a question about the house Thomas had built on it, which had improvements that represented Matilda's investment and effort over the past year. Jacob had a proposal for this. He wanted, he said, to formally deed a portion of the Clearwater Flats land to the Carter estate, specifically the acreage that the house sat on plus a workable surround, as compensation for Thomas's legitimate purchase price, which the court's restitution order from Ellis's assets would not fully cover in practical terms, since getting money out of Ellis would take time and might never be complete. Matilda listened to this and then said, "That is a very complicated arrangement." "Yes," he said. "There is a simpler one," she said. He waited. She looked at her coffee cup and then at him, and she had never in her life been the person to say a thing like this first. It had always been Thomas who moved first and she who responded. But she was 30 years old, and she had been through more in the last year than most people faced in a decade, and she had decided, in February on the anniversary of Thomas's death, to trust her own mind. "You could ask me to marry you," she said. And then the question of which land belongs to whom becomes considerably less complicated. The silence that followed this was approximately 4 seconds long. Jacob Holloway sat across from her in a Laramie breakfast restaurant in March of 1884, and the expression on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. This passage through surprise and something that might have been relief so profound it was almost pain into the clear, certain warmth of a man who has been hoping for a thing without allowing himself to hope for it. "Matilda," he said. "Yes. Will you marry me?" "I believe I just suggested that you ask me that," she said, and the smile that came with it was wide and unguarded and entirely hers. "Will you?" he said again, quietly, the playfulness gone, just the question in its full weight. "Yes," she said. "I will." They rode back to Holt County the following day, 2 days through the early spring landscape with the snow still heavy on the high places, and the lower ground beginning to show the first cautious green beneath, and the way between them on the return journey was different from the journey out, not in anything dramatic or demonstrative, in the small things, in the way they rode close enough that their horses occasionally bumped shoulders, in the way he looked at her at the end of the first day's ride, just a look that said everything that 7 months of careful propriety had been holding back, in the way she rested her head briefly against his shoulder when they stopped at the way station and the spring evening was cold and the fire was warm and she was tired in the good way, the way of someone who has finished something difficult and can now rest. Mrs. Alcott, the proprietress, saw them come in together and saw what was between them and said, dryly, "Different rooms again, I suppose." "The same as before," Jacob said. Said Mrs. Alcott, and her tone implied that she expected this to change shortly and found it perfectly reasonable. They were married in Britton's Mill on the 15th of May, 1884, in the small white church that served the valley, by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks and had a matter-of-fact approach to the ceremonies of human life that Matilda found deeply suitable. Will and Pete Danvers were there, and Pete's wife Clara, and the postmaster from Britton's Mill who had helped her with her investigations, and had developed a proprietary investment in the outcome, and 3 other families from the valley who had become something approximating friends over the months of the legal battle. Henry Whitmore had sent a letter of congratulations from Cheyenne. The Peterson family sent preserves. The McGill family sent a handmade quilt. Matilda wore a dress she had made in the preceding weeks from blue wool fabric she had ordered from the general store in Britain's Mill, and she put flowers in her hair because it was May and there were wildflowers along the creek, and she had decided, consciously and with intention, that this was a beginning, and it deserved to be acknowledged as one. Jacob, in his best suit, watched her walk down the church aisle with an expression that he did not attempt to contain or make more dignified, which was the thing she loved about it most. He was a private and composed man, and that he allowed this moment to move across his face openly and without guard was, she thought, the truest wedding gift he could have given her. The minister asked his questions and they answered them, and when he got to the part about objections, there was a brief moment where she half expected Raymond Ellis to appear at the back of the church, and she would not have put it past him even from a jail cell. But the church was quiet except for the sound of the May wind and the creek outside, and the minister completed the ceremony, and Jacob kissed her with the same directness and honesty that he brought to everything. And Pete Danvers made a sound that was almost certainly suppressed applause. They moved into the stone ranch house that Jacob had built from the creek stones 8 years ago. The house was bigger than it had looked on her first visit, which she had been too preoccupied to properly observe. There were 3 proper rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping loft, and a large porch that faced southwest toward the mountains, and she put her books on his shelves beside his books and her mother's quilt on the bed and her good dishes in the kitchen, and within a week it felt like the house had been waiting for exactly this configuration. The summer of 1884 was the finest she could remember. Not because anything in the world was easy, because nothing in the Wyoming Territory was ever exactly easy, but because there is a specific quality of life that emerges when you are doing hard work beside someone you trust completely, and she was discovering it now in its full form. They worked the ranch together. She had her cattle integrated with his by July, a combined herd that required more management but was proportionally more productive. And she proved, in the course of this work, that she had been running a ranch alone for 7 months and knew more about it than she sometimes let on, which delighted him in the way that discovering unexpected depths in a person always delights. He made her laugh regularly, which she had not anticipated from a man so habitually quiet. He had a dry, precise sense of humor that operated mostly through understatement and timing, and she was, it turned out, exactly the right audience for it. She made him laugh in return, which was rarer for him and seemed to mean more. They disagreed sometimes. About cattle management, and about money, and once, memorably, about a decision involving the fence line on the south pasture that became a genuine argument with raised voices, and both of them going quiet afterward with the particular quality of people who are not used to conflict with each other, and find it more upsetting than they expected. He went out to the barn. She finished the dishes she had been washing with more force than they required. He came back inside 40 minutes later and said, "I think you were right about the fence." She said, "I think your reasoning was also sound." They stood in the kitchen looking at each other, and then she laughed and he exhaled, and the argument dissolved into something that was partly apology and partly amusement at themselves and partly, in the way that resolved conflict between people who love each other often is, a door into a different kind of closeness. In October, she told him she was pregnant. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, and he went very still the way he did when something significant was entering his system, the same stillness she had watched him process the legal documents with, the stillness of a person who takes things seriously enough to stop and feel them before responding. Then he stood up and came around the table and held her with the kind of care that knows the difference between a moment and an ordinary moment, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed. "Are you frightened?" he asked, his voice low and close. "A little," she admitted. "Are you?" "Yes," he said immediately. "Considerably. And then, I am also the happiest I have ever been in my life." She laughed against his shoulder. "Both at once." "Both at once," he agreed, and his arms tightened around her. She wrote to her mother in Missouri, who responded with a letter of joy and immediate plans to come west in the spring, which was the first time the prospect of her mother's visit had produced in Matilda something more than mild anxiety. Her mother came. She arrived in April of 1885 on the stage from Laramie. A small and formidable woman of 55 named Matilda Carter, who had been her father's best student, and proved it within the first 4 hours of arriving by comprehensively reorganizing the kitchen to a superior configuration that Matilda refused to acknowledge was better for 3 days, and then conceded. Matilda Carter looked at her son-in-law across the supper table on the first evening and said, "You are the man who held onto land through 8 years of attempted fraud." "Yes," Jacob said. "Good," she said, and returned to her food. And that was apparently the entirety of the judgment she needed to render, because she was pleasant and helpful and clearly approving for the rest of the visit. The baby was born on the 2nd of May, 1885, with the assistance of the doctor from Britton's Mill, who had made the 15-mile drive without complaint, and of Matilda Carter, who had attended enough births in her life to be calm and practical and useful in exactly the ways required. It was a boy. They named him Thomas Jacob Holloway, which had the quality of completeness, the way a sentence has when it says exactly what it means. Jacob held his son for the first time in the quiet hour after the birth, when the doctor had gone, and Matilda was making tea in the kitchen and Matilda was resting, still awake but barely, and the May morning was coming through the window in long pale lines. He sat in the chair beside the bed and held the small, certain fact of his child and looked at the face of his wife, and Matilda watched him do this from her exhausted, comfortable, half-dreaming state, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a person's life aligned with what they had been building toward, when the work and the loss and the struggle reached a moment that justified all of it, and that she was glad to be here to see it. Thomas Jacob Holloway was a healthy, vigorous boy who came into his first summer with great enthusiasm for everything available to his senses. By August, he was making sounds that were clearly intended as communication. By October, he was reaching for things. By the following spring, he was pulling himself upright against the kitchen chairs and regarding the floor between himself and any nearby object with the calculating expression of someone planning a campaign. The ranch grew. Jacob expanded the herd in 1886 with careful investment, and Matilda managed the household accounts with the meticulous precision Thomas had always said she had, and which she had never before had full scope to exercise. They hired a third hand, a young man named Samuel Bright of about 20 who was new to the territory and good with cattle and eager to learn, and who proved reliable enough over the following year to be given increasing responsibility. Ellis's story concluded in the fall of 1885, when the territorial court finalized the fraud case, and he was convicted on multiple counts. He served 18 months in the territorial prison and was permanently barred from any public office in Wyoming Territory. The restitution he had been ordered to pay was partial at best, his personal assets having been considerably less than his public presentation suggested, but the court's order stood on record, and he was no longer in a position to harm anyone with his particular form of dishonesty. Matilda heard about the conviction from the postmaster in Britton's Mill and rode home and told Jacob over supper, and they did not celebrate it exactly, because celebrating the fall of another person felt wrong to both of them, but they acknowledged it with a quiet and complete sense of conclusion, the closing of a chapter that had opened long before either of them had been properly prepared for it. The house grew with them. Jacob built an addition in the spring of 1887, 2 more rooms and an expanded kitchen, because the stone house that had been perfectly sufficient for one man was beginning to feel compressed with a wife and a 2-year-old who required significant space for the activities of being 2 years old. The building of it was a project they undertook together, Jacob doing the heavy structural work with Will and Samuel, while Matilda managed the planning and the interior details, and the daily reality of maintaining a household during construction, which she accomplished through a combination of organization and what Jacob privately considered a remarkable tolerance for disorder. He told her this one evening while they were sitting on the porch in the long summer twilight, Thomas asleep in the addition for the first time in his new room, the smell of fresh timber still in the air. "You have remarkable tolerance for disorder," he said. "I was married to Thomas Carter for 4 years," she replied. "He was a brilliant and comprehensive source of disorder. You loved him. Very much." She was looking at the mountains. "And I love you." It was not the first time she had said it, but it always landed on him the same way, with the same quality of arriving into him rather than passing over him, finding its specific place, settling there. "I love you," he said, and his voice in the Wyoming twilight was the most honest thing she had ever heard. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, the wide and crowded Wyoming stars that she had been learning the names of because he knew them all and she had decided she should. And Thomas made a sound from the new room that suggested he was not entirely asleep, and Jacob went in and she heard him, through the open window, singing quietly in a voice she had not known he had, something old and slow, and the baby was quiet. She stayed on the porch a little longer. In 1888 they had a daughter, Hannah Eleanor Holloway, who arrived with the same decisive energy as her older brother, but applied it differently, to watchfulness rather than motion, a quality of taking everything in with large dark eyes that suggested she was making assessments and would share the results when she had completed them. Thomas was 3 years old when Hannah was born, and regarded his sister initially with a kind of interested suspicion that gradually evolved, over the following months, into the dedicated and possessive affection of an older brother, who has decided that this particular small person is his personal responsibility. Hannah regarded this attention with the evaluating dark eyes and occasional imperious sounds that suggested she found it satisfactory, but was keeping her options open. Matilda watched her children with the particular quality of attention that a mother who has come to parenthood, knowing what loss feels like, applies to the everyday moments that others might overlook. The morning light on Thomas's hair, the way Hannah's fist closed around her finger, the ordinary geography of her children's faces as they changed and grew, the small archaeology of who they were becoming. Jacob watched her watch them, which was its own thing, the observation of love observing love, and he thought that no deed he had ever held and no piece of land he had ever claimed was the most valuable thing in his possession, that distinction belonging entirely to this life that had been built, piece by piece, out of resistance and honesty, and the unexpected arrival of a woman who had come to dispute something, and stayed to become the center of everything. The summer of 1889 was the year Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state, an event that produced in Britain's Mill a celebration of considerable enthusiasm that lasted the better part of 2 days and involved, at various points, fireworks and a brass band of variable quality, and an amount of whiskey that Will Danvers would refer to for several years afterward as historic. Jacob and Matilda attended with their children, Thomas now a 4-year-old of energetic opinions and Hannah a 1-year-old of evaluating observations, and they stood in the main street of Britain's Mill and listened to the speeches about the new state and its possibilities, and Matilda thought about what it meant to be part of a place at the moment of its becoming, to have fought for your stake in it, and stayed through the difficulty, and built something that was now woven into the fabric of what the place was. She thought about 1883, that September morning when she had ridden into a stranger's yard with a contested deed, and a heart full of misdirected fury. And the distance between that morning and this one was not just 6 years, but an entire transformation of what her life meant and who she was within it. Jacob was standing beside her with Hannah on his hip, the baby regarding the brass band with the thoughtful attention she brought to all novel phenomena, and Thomas was somewhere in the crowd with Pete and Clara Danvers, who had taken charge of him, because he moved at a speed that required the combined attention of multiple adults when fireworks were involved. He looked at Matilda and she looked at him, and the brass band played something patriotic and slightly off-key, and the September light was the same color it had been on that morning 6 years ago, the long gold of the high country that always seemed on the edge of something. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was a thing he sometimes asked her because he was the kind of person who needed to know and was not too proud to ask. "Yes," she said, completely. "Are you?" "Since September of 1883, he said. She laughed and took his free hand, and he held it and held their daughter, and the celebration went on around them, and the Wyoming evening came down slow and warm and particular, the way it does in the high country when summer is still deciding to leave. The land was his. The deed was clear. The creek ran through the seasons in its reliable, cold, and permanent way, and the stone house stood as it always had, solid and unadorned and built to last, and the life within it had grown into something that occupied every room and spilled out onto the porch and into the yard, and across the fields and up to the tree line and back again. Matilda Carter, who was now Matilda Holloway, and who kept both names in the specific way of a woman who knows that she is both things and neither cancels the other, stood in her kitchen one November morning in 1889, watching the snow begin to fall over Clearwater Flats, the same snow that fell every year at the same elevation with the same certainty, and she thought about all the things that had brought her to this particular moment in this particular place, and she would not have changed any of it. Not the loss or the grief or the misdirected fury or the long legal battle or the night in the spare room listening to Wyoming Dark, because all of it had led here, to this kitchen, to the sound of her husband's boots on the porch as he came in from the early chores, stamping the snow off, the habit of years, to Thomas's voice from the upper room where he was supposedly still sleeping, but was clearly already awake and narrating something to himself in the elaborate private language of a 4-year-old boy. To Hannah, who would wake soon and require feeding and would greet the day with those evaluating dark eyes that were going to be, Matilda was quite certain, something remarkable to witness in full flower. To the creek she could hear through the kitchen window, running beneath the snow, cold and clean and absolutely reliable, the reason the land had been worth fighting for in the first place. Jacob came through the door on a gust of cold air and snow, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way he always did, the way that had never stopped being the most direct and honest thing she encountered in any given day. And she handed him a cup of coffee without preamble, because the domesticity of this was as much a form of love as anything more articulated. He took the cup and came and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out together at the snow on Clearwater Flats, the white and permanent snow of Wyoming, and the creek making its cold, bright way beneath it. "It is going to be a good winter," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is going to be a good winter." And it was. And the spring after it was good, and the years after that, built of the same honest material as everything they had made together, patient and real and enduring as fieldstone carried up from a creek bed by a man who knew what he was building toward, even before he knew who he was building it for.